Shattering Myths. I'm your host, Yahowah. Before we turn to the Torah and continue the ongoing story of the conditions that existed outside of the garden once Adam and Yahowah were expelled, and yet before the flood, as Yahowah chose Noah to be the trustworthy guide, we have Glenn, who's called in from Philadelphia, who would like to make a comment or ask a question on entitlements. Hello, Glenn. Welcome back to Shattering Myths.
Hello, Yahowah. This whole question of the social safety net and entitlement programs is fraught with a lot of complex variables. I'm myself have always been a fiscal conservative and preferred, personal initiative and stuff. But in order to make it work, people have to be able, to exert that effort within a context of an economy where they can actually get ahead. I mean, we've been in a situation, both, Europe and the U.S. have not overpopulated. They've had infrastructure. There's been near zero population growth for decades. And yet the tariffs have not been permitted. Other nations charge us tariffs, but we can't protect our economy with tariffs. The jobs first were sent south of the border to Mexican maquiladoras, and that wasn't cheap enough, so they were further exported to China, where the billions of people work in slave wages. Here in America, we have the working poor and people working multiple part-time jobs who still can't make ends meet. So, while I've always been a fan of personal initiative and responsible individual, I listen to someone at the other extreme, like say Webster Tarpley, who's thinks healthcare is a right, I don't know. I mean, I think this is just inherently a problem that can't be solved even by the most conscientious of, even if you had a government policy or government policies, free it's just going to give us slave wages. Yeah.
Yeah. Let me deal with your question the best I can, Glenn, and thank you for sharing it with us. The reality is that the government works both in the take-away hand and in the give-it hand. Vast preponderance of legislatures and presidents alike have no concept of what it means to run and build a business, and so most of the legislation that is passed restricts the operation of a business. Most of the jobs did not go overseas or go to maquiladoras because there was such a difference in the cost of just ordinary labor. It's all of the burdens that the United States government put on businesses that made it financially impossible to make goods here, whether they be environmental regulations or health care regulations or Social Security regulations or employment benefit regulations or COBRA regulations. It really goes on and on. And what the United States government has essentially done is make it almost impossible to be an effective manufacturer in America. There are a few that succeed, but that number is dwindling. And so the government has gamed the system contrary to business through its regulations and through its taxation. For example, taxation of corporations in America is amongst the highest in the world. And then when businesses therefore cannot grow and hire more people and cannot have favorable economic relations with their employees, then government comes in as the safety net to resolve the problem that they themselves caused. It's very much like the current recession we're in, where the government caused the home loan crisis. It's manipulation of the banking business as it relates to home loans over the course of 30 years, gamed the system so that it was absolutely destined to implode. And then when the government caused the system to implode, it went in and blamed private industry, imposed more regulations, empowered themselves all the more as a direct result. It's exactly the same thing they're doing in the entitlement aspect of all of this. And the very notion that a liberal will blame business and infer that business wants to employ people at slave labor rates is moronic. It's that this idea that government good, business bad is the mentality that is being promoted today. And the fact is that business provides 100% of the income that government has. If it's not from business, the government doesn't have anything to spend. It's corporate taxes and the earnings, the income of people who are working that government taxes. Even import duties are a result of business taxing. It's extraordinary, all of the taxes that are imposed on business, and yet business is presented as the villain rather than the only solution. And they really are the only solution in this regard. So I have my view, which my view is that the U.S. government has gone about the business of rewarding failure and of punishing success to the extent that now we are a nation that is mostly unsuccessful, and that every time we try to throw money at it, we make the problem worse. So I hope, Glenn, that answers your question. I do want to make a comment on Billy Graham before we move on. Billy Graham said that from all of his heart, he wants to leave us with the truth. Well, I'm going to tell you something. The truth does not come from Billy Graham's heart. If you want to know the truth, read the Torah. If you want to know the truth, read the prophets. Read what Yahowah said. There you'll find the truth. Billy Graham never, ever preaches from the Torah or the prophets. You will never find the truth emanating out of that despicable man's heart. His next statement was that the cross is where you'd find hope. What a lie. There is no cross in the Torah, prophets, and Psalms. There's not even a cross mentioned in the Christian New Testament. The actual Greek word that is used to describe the implement is stauros. It means upright pillar. It is a translation of Edom in Hebrew. Edom is used throughout the Torah to describe the upright pillar of the tabernacle. It's the doorway to heaven. But it is not a cross in the sense of the Christian implement. In fact, even the death state that Yahushua suffered, becoming the Passover lamb on Passover, was not shaped as the Christian cross. It was in the form of a capital T, not a lowercase t with the cross member set below the top of the upright. The cross that is the Christian symbol is purely pagan. And the shape of the implement is irrelevant. What is relevant is the upright pillar upon which he hung, because he was the upright one, and those upright pillars served as a symbol of the upright pillars that form the doorway to life that is made possible because of the Passover lamb on Passover. All of the rest of it is pure pagan corruption. Also the quote, "I recognize that not one is righteous, no, not one." That's not from Yahowah. It's not from Yahushua. It's not from God. It's from the most despicable man who ever lived. It's from Paul. It's found in Romans 3:10. Yes, this is the book of Romans where Paul orders Christians, those who believe him, to submit to governments. What government? The Roman government. What was the most despicable government on the planet at the time? The Roman government. They were pagans. They professed that the leaders were gods. They attacked the promised land, Israel. They salted Israel. They destroyed Yahowah's temple. They were savages. They were the most despicable government on earth at the time, and amongst the most despicable governments of all of human history. Look what they did once they destroyed Yahowah's temple and looted it, and out of the money that they looted from the temple, they built the Colosseum in Rome. In fact, used the Jews that they hauled into slavery as the labor to build it. And what did they do there? What did the government of Rome put their spectacles of death and of torture and of mutilation? And Paul in the 13th chapter orders his followers, his believers, to submit to that authority. Well, I'm going to tell you that there are a lot of people who are righteous. Paul is not among them. The purpose of the Torah, the purpose of the covenant, is to enable us to become righteous from God's perspective. That is the purpose of it. When we avail ourselves of Pesach, Passover, and matzah, unyeasted bread, we become perfect and immortal, born anew from above on Bokodim as the first children of God. Yahowah even said that Dode, who, had a lot of flaws in his daily life, was righteous in his eyes because what did Dode do? He observed the Torah. He capitalized on the terms and conditions of the covenant. And so God viewed him as righteous. And there are so many more. We read just the other day that Yahowah took Enoch, because he walked with him. Therefore, Enoch was righteous. We read yesterday that Noah was selected because he was righteous, Sadak. He was upright in his home, setting a fine example. And so for Paul to say, none is righteous, no, not one, he's missing all of these individuals whom God has said otherwise. It's Paul versus Yahowah, Paul versus God. You can choose, if you're a Christian, to believe Paul, but if you do, then you are rejecting God. It is just horrendous to have to listen to that pathetic Billy Graham ad on Salem Radio Network News. I'm embarrassed on behalf of the Genesis Communication Network for even allowing them to provide their news and commercials on these programs. It's not my choice. I have protested against it, and I will continue to protest against it because of despicable ads like this from Billy Graham. Everyone that has ever believed Billy Graham has had their soul annihilated. They no longer exist. His promises are nothing but lies. Now, turning to the Torah passage that we considered at the end of the program yesterday. The region in God's presence was corrupt, and the land was filled with violence, destruction, and plunder, with Hamas, terrorism, lawlessness, maiming, cruelty, killing, thievery, injustice, and looting without any moral restraint. The land was overflowing with these things. It was satisfied with these things, with those proclaiming the benefit of these things. Welcome back to Shattering Myths. In this particular Torah passage, where God has said that the region here, which would be the region from the headwaters to the mouth of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, this would be from eastern Turkey today, the shores of the Black Sea as it was back then, not as it is now, all the way down through Mesopotamia, the heartland of the Assyrian and Babylonian empires, all the way down to Ur, which would be the Sumerian empire, Sumer. God was saying that that entire region was filled with, was overflowing with, and it was even satisfied with violence, destruction, and plunder, terrorism, lawlessness, maiming, cruelty, killing, thievery, injustice, and looting without any moral restraint. So, in the statement, God has made it clear that he recognized that a deceitful, destructive, deadly, and damning dogma, or dogmas, had become pervasive. He recognized that the consequence of unchecked corruption was Hamas, terrorism, lawlessness, cruelty, looting. He knew that if he didn't eliminate this religious and political activity and its host, which would be the people that had been infected by it, there would no longer be any hope for anyone. It's like in America, that this dependence and entitlement breeds dependence and entitlement. Pretty soon, there is no hope for anyone. the likelihood, for example, of a Muslim child to be anything other than a Muslim and live in poverty, and if a woman be subjected to hellish conditions, and if a man be encouraged to be a jihadist, it's ubiquitous within the society. There is no hope in any Islamic society. And so God recognized this, and he says, I got to do something about it. And if I don't do something about it, then the whole creation will be for naught. So put yourself in God's place for a moment. If you were God, and you could slay Muhammad and his most loyal 100 companions, circa 622 CE, would you, knowing, because you're God, that Islam would ravage the world, terrorizing, killing, and plundering hundreds of millions of people, including the 3,000 murdered in the name of Allah on September 11th, 2001, knowing that they would be the principal terrorists trying to steal, ravage Israel? What if you could wipe out Hitler and the 10,000 most fervent Nazis in 1938? Would you do so to spare their 50 million victims? Would you? In 1948, would you eliminate the 100,000 most loyal supporters of Mao Zedong to spare the lives of 40 million otherwise innocent Chinese men, women, and children from the slaughter that they would oversee, they would cause? Would you? The reason Yahowah asked his chosen people to destroy Jericho, which is actually Jericho, meaning of the moon, which is means in Hebrew a heap of ruins, Gibeon, which is Gibon in Hebrew, conveying the idea of evil and idolatrous, Lachish in Hebrew, portraying those individuals who consider themselves invincible, Hebron from Chebron, meaning to associate with the occult, Debir, which is to fear or revere the word, and Hazor, written Chatzor in Hebrew, meaning protective enclosure or castle. The reason that God asked his chosen people to destroy these 7 towns in 1400 BCE and to eliminate the populations of these villages and towns is for the same reason he responded similarly in 2968 BCE during the flood. Had these corrupt individuals and places been allowed to exist within the promised land, they would have infected and adversely affected the chosen people who had been chosen to be Yahweh's witnesses, meaning that you and I wouldn't be able to read and study the Word of God or benefit from it had he not done these things. Now, when we return to Shattering Myths, we'll consider just briefly the largest of these towns, which was Jericho, or known now as Jericho, and what its population would have been at the time, so we know the scope of what Yahowah was asking his chosen people to do. I'm Yada. This is Shattering Myths. We'll be back after the commercial break. Shattering Myths. There's so many atheists that sponsor websites, as well as Muslims that parlay off of them, that condemn Yahowah for his instructions to destroy these 7 towns. Now, they do so without recognizing why it was in our interest to do so, why it was in mankind's interest to do so, why it was the most merciful thing to do. They're incapable of recognizing that because political correctness has caused people to accept mutually exclusive things and to embrace everybody's point of view, even if someone's religion is caustic, destructive, counterproductive, deceitful, deadly, damning. Well, God's not bothered by political correctness. He is driven by that which is good for us. He is merciful, and therefore he is never accepting or accommodating of the merciless. The religious and political influences, the military and economic influences that were pervasive at this time, which is nearly now 5,000 years ago, is that people were being ravaged. They were being savaged. They were being victimized. And God said, that's got to stop. Now, as it relates to the Promised Land, he was going to reveal his entire testimony to us there. He was going to provide us with the solution to mankind's woes in this one place through this one people. And if he had allowed those in these towns to continue, then it would be just like moving into a house that was rat-infested with the rats having the bubonic plague. If you would move your family into a home where the rats were all infected with bubonic plague, you wouldn't be merciful. You'd be merciless. And that's what God did. He says the house has to be cleaned of these rats that are plagued with this disease of religion. Now, the other thing that people don't recognize is how small these places were. Jericho was the largest of them. The research of Jericho circa 1400 BCE suggests that at most 600 people lived there. Ai would have been smaller: Gibeon, Lachish, Hebron, Debir, and Hazor. 7 towns, all less than 600 individuals. Now, God gave them their life. It's very much like the Food Steps program, where the individual family is receiving $36 less per month on their charity. God gave them their life. It was a gift. They squandered it. God said their iniquity was full, which means there was no hope for them. There was no way for them to be anything other than satisfied with the corruption of religion and politics, and therefore they were sponsoring that which was merciless. And recognizing that, this very small number of people, God said, these are rats and infested with the worst of all diseases: religion, politics, militarism, economic schemes. We need to rid them for my family to move into my home. And yet this was a one-time event, 1400 BCE, never replicated since, no instructions for any ongoing killing. There's not a single mandate from God that gives you authority outside of Israel, outside of this time, to act violently towards anyone. And yet in this place, it was the most merciful and compassionate thing to do. So as I've said, using Yahowah's parlance, their iniquity was full, meaning that the likes of these people depicted during Noah's day were in the same situation. There was no longer any hope for the Canaanites to be able to coexist in a civilized way with their neighbors, or any hope that their children wouldn't become equally corrupt. For the benefit of the many, to retain hope, to punish the perpetrators rather than allow them to Hamas their victims, the corrupt were curtailed. It was the most fair and merciful thing to do. And because God gave them their lives and allowed them to live, it was his to take without actually punishing them. If you just like the food stamp program, if you give somebody less money than you gave them the previous money, you've still given them something. They are a net beneficiary even when you reduce the amount. God gave them life. If he reduces the tenure of it, he has not taken something away from them. He has, on the whole, viewed as a net, given them something. We are not God. So this example was only to demonstrate the proper perspective, to view what God was going to do with the flood, what he did in the Promised Land. It is not for you to act like you are God, because you and I are not God. And God, you will notice, did not act subsequently. He allowed man free will. He allowed us to pursue evil. He allowed us to become Nazis. He allowed us to become Muslims. He allowed us to terrorize and to kill. He allowed even this nation that considers itself a Christian nation to become the biggest terrorist nation on earth, particularly in World War II, particularly in the way that we fought the Civil War. God allows free will. It is a prime mandate, because without free will there can be no covenant, because the covenant is our choice. It's God's desire, but ultimately our choice. So God inspected the area, and indeed it was corrupt. It was spoiled, it was ravaged and devastated, destroyed. For all related human flesh, basar, treading upon the earth, and it had become a putrid and polluted slime pit of corruption and decay. This is Bereshith in the beginning, Genesis 6:12. The NIV interlinear renders this passage, God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt. For he, as in man, corrupted the way of every person on the earth. We had corrupted our planet. We are doing it now. One of the issues of translating this is the meaning of bashar. It is Akkadian root, suggests that the term conveys a descendant, a blood relative, or someone who is near of kin. The best etymological tools indicate bashar conveys the notion of human flesh, especially that of related people. While the word has often been translated living things and creatures, even as animals, based upon the context in which this is used, bashar can just as easily convey humans and people, both men and women, particularly those who are descendants of a known individual, in this case, Adam and Yahowah. And it is perhaps also true that Yahowah chose bashar to convey now the animalistic nature of the people who were acting badly. And it's also true that in this particular case, at this time, there would have been a reasonable number of people who would have been direct descendants of Adam and Yahowah, and thus had a nasama, a conscience. They were probably the political and the religious leaders, the military leaders that were perpetrating these ruinous myths, and many people whom they had affected, and being infected, they had become as ruinous, but they may not have yet benefited from a nasama, and thus were just animals, but he lumped them all together as one. It's also interesting that bashar means to be a herald or preacher, which is God's way of saying that those humans that are religious are animals. Further, in the context of Bereshith 6:12, the idea of related humans is consistent with the story Yahowah has been telling and will continue to tell. And in this regard, God will provide a unique twist in his depiction of Basar in just 5 verses, one which serves to confirm the human rendering, at least in this particular case. And the reason I've shared all this with you is that I don't want you to say that, I want you to know that when a word is challenging to translate, when there are options relative to the meaning of the word, I want you to have some sense of what those options are, and have an appreciation of the thought process I went through to render it one way versus another. That way, when you are studying on your own and you see the word, you're going to say, wait a minute, there's some choices here. Let me study the etymological roots of this word. Let me study other places where this word is used. Let me view this word in the context of the story that is being told. And to think your way through the process. Because when you do, you're going to learn. Your eyes will be open. And you won't be reliant on somebody telling you, well, this is absolute truth and anybody else's rendering is rubbish. That's just not the case. The more you study on your own, the more you're equipped with the tools to think this through on your own, the better. And that's why I strongly encourage people to check everything that you hear. That's why the story that I'm telling you, it's all backed up in writing. You can go to yahowah.com and read all of this yourself, and every word that is translated is presented there for your consideration so that you can test it yourself. And the more that you explore on your own, the better. Your relationship with Yahowah will grow. Your appreciation for him will grow when you do. Now, Yahowah isn't, at least at that time, wasn't pleased with his creation. So if he didn't care about the consequence, he had a choice. He could ignore them, he could wipe them out, or he could prune them back. Those were God's choices. So at this time, at the time of the flood, some 5,000 years ago, if God was oblivious to the consequence of his decisions, he could have ignored all of humankind and just let us continue to ravage one another and destroy one another and eliminate hope. He could have done that. He could have wiped us all out to the last and say, boy, that was a big mistake. I ain't never going down that path again. Humankind, you're gone. Could have done that. He could have chosen to wipe out all Homo sapiens as opposed to just Homo sapiens who had been affected in this region from eastern Turkey down to the mouth of the Tigris and Euphrates River. Or he could just prune us back, cut away the dead, cut away that which was infected, so that the rest, those who were not affected, might have hope, might be fruitful, might benefit from that. God said to Noah, I am pruning, Kesh. I am limiting, constraining, and diminishing, even putting a limit to, from kasats, to cut off part of the extremity by shearing, all humans who are related, bashar, moving about before me. Indeed, the region is filled with terrorism, with lawlessness, with cruelty, with Hamas, with violence and destruction, with plundering and killing and thievery, because of their presence. We will continue with Yah's statement in a moment. So we considered what God's choices were. He could have chosen to wipe out all Homo sapiens, or just those who were related in this particular region, which is the region that was problematic at this time. He could choose to ignore everyone. He could choose to prune just those that were corrupt, and to allow the healthy creation, that which still had promise, to live. You know, if you have a tree or a vine and you prune the dead out of it, then what you're doing is allowing that which is still uncorrupted, undecaying, to thrive. So what did God choose? He didn't ignore malfeasance. He didn't tolerate it. He didn't embrace it. He chose to prune. God said to Noah, I am pruning. I am limiting, constraining, and diminishing, putting a limit to, from kasats, to cut off part of, an extremity of, by shearing. All humans who are related, bashar. It's even here, I love the definition of bashar here, were people who are preachers and messengers, moving about, coming and going before me. Indeed, the region is filled with, Malah is overflowing with, has become satisfied with Hamas, terrorism, lawlessness, and cruelty, because of their presence. So it is the presence of these preachers, of these animals acting as God's message, who pretend that they are moving about as intermediaries to God, that there was terrorism, lawlessness, and cruelty in the land. And God says, I'm going to prune them. I'm going to put limits to what they can do. Look, here and now, Hina, I will bring ruin to, I will catch them in their pit. I will catch them in the middle of their decay, wiping them out by laying waste to them, along with this region. God was going to deal with the problem, isolate the problem, and then remedy the problem, which is to remove this religious and political and militaristic and economic influence and those that it had infected. So just as gardeners prune plants to cut out the decay and to promote healthy growth, God has prepared to remove corrupt individuals for the sake of those who had not yet been contaminated. And while that is obvious, it isn't obvious that our world today is filled with the same kind of conditions that existed there, but we are become almost satisfied with terrorism because we won't even deal with its root cause. We become Torahless. We're cruel. We're violent. We're destructive. We plunder. We kill. We steal. We loot. We show no moral restraint. Our world is very similar to the world that God wanted to deal with at that time. As such, might Yahweh's tribulation judgments, the pruning of humankind, will, when they occur in 2033 or beginning in 2026, in the late fall of 2026 through 2033, with the majority of that pruning taking place in 2030 through 2033. Isn't it a very similar act to what's happening here? In fact, almost everyone that God's dealing with, he's dealing with surrounding those who are trying to terrorize and infect Israel. In fact, when he intercedes in the Magog War to end it, he is destroying those who came to destroy Israel while they are in Israel. You know, catching them red-handed. It's, you know, they're in the middle of the bank trying to steal what isn't theirs, and that's where God deals with them. You know, in the Armageddon War, which follows, Yahowah returns and annihilates those who have come to destroy the promised land, to destroy the chosen people. You know, it is exactly the same thing. Let's prune the dead out so that which isn't decayed can grow, can live. So perhaps we're seeing in the preamble to the deluge a preview of what to expect during the tribulation and why we're going to witness these events. In his Olivet Discourse, Yahusha listed world war, an increase in terrorism, and Torahlessness as things which would be the birth pangs preceding his return. Mankind will devolve into the same kinds of behaviors, terrorizing one another, and God is going to deal with it once again. This has been Shattering Myths with Yana. We look forward to talking with you at this time tomorrow. May Yah bless.